Chapter 6, The Shaping of a Nation. Part 4, Jacksonian Culture. Tocqueville's Democracy in America. In 1831, the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville arrived in America, ostensibly to study the American prison system. But he and his associate Gustave de Beaumont were truly more interested in studying the American society in general, a subject of great interest to the French. Tocqueville published the results of his study as Democracy in America in 2 volumes, appearing in 1835 and 1840, at the height of the Jacksonian era. It provides an incredibly insightful view of the American culture by one standing outside that culture. He noted the hugely individualistic spirit of the typical American, and the restlessness of the American heart, which was always looking for the next challenge before it had completed the work on a previous challenge. He also noted the spirit which defended basic equality of all whites, ever ready to challenge presumptions of superiority on the part of others. He correctly attributed the origins of this egalitarian spirit to the Puritans of New England, as well as the principle of the sovereignty of the people, founded in the early Puritan covenants and state constitutions. But he also noted the contradictions to all this posed by the agonizing question of slavery. Also, from a Frenchman's view, with its more liberal attitudes towards marriage and the sexes, he was distressed at how rigid were the sexual roles assigned to men and women, both in and out of marriage. But this also was a Puritan legacy unknown in France. He was also concerned about the dangers of democracy turning into a tyranny of the ignorant majority, unrestrained by the more enlightened understanding of social dynamics, by society's more polished and better educated social elite. And he correctly predicted the tragedy of war that would eventually occur over this wrenching issue of slavery. In short, he described clearly the good and the not-so-good of Jacksonian America, at least as the French understood the social ideals of good and bad. The Industrial Revolution continues forward in the East. The restlessness of the American heart that Tocqueville noticed was clearly obvious in the incredible amount of industrial activity and innovation pushing the American economy ever forward. The development of the steam engine permitted extensive mechanical operations to take place where no water power was readily available to turn the wheels of industry's many new mills appearing across the North. By 1840, there were some 1,200 cotton mills in operation, mostly in the American Northeast, connecting the East with the Ohio River Valley. Foodstuffs, raw materials, and even finished goods were constantly on the move in America, along the turnpikes and the many canals being laid out across the East. By 1818, the National Road had been completed, linking the American East at Baltimore and Philadelphia with the Ohio River Valley at Pittsburgh, and thus access to the American interior all the way to the Mississippi. With the development of steam power, paddle wheel boats able to go both ways on the great rivers of American interior were soon moving vast amounts of produce from the west back to the east, and people and their goods to the new lives in the west. Footnote: in August of 1807, Robert Fulton's steam-driven dual paddle-wheel North River steamboat made the amazing 150-mile boat trip up the Hudson River from New York City to Albany in 32 hours of actual travel. It's not counting the stops along the way. The Erie Canal. Not to be outdone by Baltimore and Philadelphia, New York, under the direction of its industrious governor, DeWitt Clinton, decided in 1817 to dig a canal from the Hudson River at Albany all the way to Lake Erie at Buffalo, thus gaining access to the American interior by way of the Great Lakes. The 363-mile project was open for business by 1825, which turned out to be a highly profitable venture. The first railroads. In 1827, the town fathers of Baltimore, seeing water traffic outbid their wagon road, decided to investigate the possibilities of laying a railroad, then under development in England. In 1828, they laid the first rails, and by 1830 they had completed the first portion of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Then, not to be outdone by New York with its Erie Canal and Baltimore with its railroad, Massachusetts in 1830 and 1831 decided to undertake the building of a railroad across the low mountains to the west, to link up Boston with Albany on the Erie Canal, completing the program by 1842. 8 years later, in 1850, almost 3,000 miles of rail line then connected New England with even the Great Lakes. And by 1852, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was the first eastern railroad to reach the Ohio River. This was such a boon to business that the following year, 1853, the mighty New York Central Railroad was formed by consolidating 10 smaller railroad companies. Meanwhile, in the South, in 1828, the town fathers of Charleston decided to open up their city to the Savannah River by rail to gain some of the trade which was prospering rival city Savannah tremendously. When it was completed in 1833, it was at that point the world's longest railroad. Eventually, the South extended the reach of its rail system by 1851, reaching Chattanooga on the Tennessee River, and from there, ultimately Memphis on the Mississippi River. The mechanical reaper revolutionizes agriculture. In 1831, Cyrus McCormick held a demonstration of his new reaper, which with one mule and one driver could harvest wheat at 6 times the rate of a single farm worker. Footnote. McCormick's claim to have invented the reaper was challenged by another inventor, Obed Hussey, whose 1833 invention was in fact a better machine. The two improved their models and competed until Hussey was finally driven out of business. Needless to say, the reaper now became not only highly sought after, it soon became standard equipment on the large farms of the American Midwest, which themselves were industrial enterprises rather than just mom-and-pop operations designed merely to support a single family. Individualism and isolation of life in the opening West. The American world was changing fast, and change itself produced its own problems, psychological as well as physical. On top of all this change, it was obvious by 1830 that the land was playing out in the East. The stony soil of New England had never been that great, and stressed by a rapidly expanding population, the region was unable to sustain a stable agricultural existence. So, in the 1830s and 1840s, saw streams of New Englanders heading west across the Appalachian Mountains and down the Ohio River to find new homes in Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, and across the Mississippi into Missouri. Likewise, the cotton farmers of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia were playing out, sending settlers west into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and even into the northern Mexico territory of Texas. Unlike the planned movements and settlements of the Puritans 2 centuries earlier, there was no organization or coordination to this movement. individuals just simply up and moved in the hope of starting a new life in the West. But life in the West proved to be isolating and dangerous under the constant threat of Indian attack. Footnote. The results were always murderous for men, women, and children, or worse, torturous, because Indians loved to gather to watch their captives writhe in carefully administered pain until they finally expired. Yet, such a life produced highly independent and self-sufficient Americans, hunters and riflemen, well able to secure meat from nature and prepared to fend off the dangerous Indian. Unitarianism and deism also flourish in the East. At the same time, for others, especially those living along coastal America, a comfortable small-town life, dependent on an economy other than just agriculture, seemed to have a natural peace and prosperity to it. Not surprisingly, life took on a more rational character, thus stepping back from its previous fervency in its Christian spirituality. Americans, especially among the more leisured professional classes, found themselves less interested in what God might do in their lives, and more interested in what they might achieve for themselves under this more rational social realm clearly emerging around them. They did not abandon Christianity because being Christian was understood to be the same as being civilized. But the faith component, that is, trust in God as the essential higher power in their lives, was disappearing. Its place was being taken by a rational morality, a key part of Enlightenment humanism, that was sweeping intellectual circles at the time, in America as well as in Europe. Such humanism usually claimed the moral teachings of Scripture, especially the teachings of Jesus, as its Christian foundation. But in the end, no such connection was absolutely necessary, for these were self-evident truths that any rational person would understand as the foundation of any life well lived. French revolutionaries went so far, in fact, as to disdain even this slender Christian connection with their utopian idealism. Once again, as in the enlightened days of the late 1600s and early 1700s, enlightened Americans of the early 1800s were convinced that human reason was vastly superior to the pre-scientific superstitions about life held by Americans who were intellectually unable to shake off the superstitious beliefs about people walking on water and raising the dead back to life. They were easily disdainful of those who clung emotionally to a religion drawn from a darker past. Of course, they failed to notice that new rational humanism was no newer than the story of Adam and Eve's fall in the Garden of Eden, or the long biblical narrative about the repeated wanderings of ancient Israel away from the counsel and discipline of God, and the tragic results. Christian Unitarians. Sadly, among those moving in the direction were a number of Congregationalist pastors, concentrated heavily in the Boston area. In 1825, over 100 of these pastors, mostly from New England, came together to form the American Unitarian Association, in part to undo the Calvinism that had early formed the foundations of the Congregationalist churches of the region. Their goal was to bring Christianity more in line with the recent discoveries of science and with simple humanistic logic that found much of the traditional biblical claims of Christianity to be completely unbelievable. They were certain that in making these adjustments, they were strengthening the foundations of the Christian religion that underlay a fast-developing American society and culture. Jefferson's Unitarianism. Another individual to figure big in this rising humanism was, in his later life, Thomas Jefferson. In 1822, Jefferson wrote to his friend Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse attacking the foundations of traditional Christianity, pointing out in particular the ancient apologist Athanasius and the more recent Calvin as false shepherds or usurpers of the Christian name. Quoting Jefferson, those two teaching a counter-religion made up of the deliria of crazy imaginations, as foreign from Christianity as that is of Mohammed. Their blasphemies have driven thinking men into infidelity. End of his quote. In that same letter, Jefferson, who had published an updated Bible eliminating all the miracle stories and focusing only on the moral teachings of Scripture, professed that the simple doctrines of Jesus, to love the only God with all one's heart and one's neighbor as oneself, had been perverted by adding Platonizing doctrine. Parentheses, Jefferson did not like Plato very much either, end of parentheses, most evident in Calvinist dogma. But he was confident that such dark days were becoming a thing only of the past. Thus he also states, I rejoice in this blessed country of free inquiry and belief, which has surrendered its creed and conscience to neither kings nor priests. The genuine doctrine of only one God is reviving, and I trust there is not a young man now living in the United States who will not die a Unitarian. For those living in the comfort of a secure existence, untroubled by enemies or economic hard times, healthy and prosperous, the promise of the Enlightenment seemed to be beyond all serious question. Emerson and the Transcendentalists. Another version of this development were the Transcendentalists, who reached well beyond the logical world of the Unitarians, with their mystical quest for the divine as a higher order of disciplined thought. They sought, through different forms of spiritual discipline, to embrace divinity, both in a oneness with nature and a sense of reaching beyond even the natural. They sought to be as fully human as possible, so as to find the oneness of divinity as fully as possible. They, too, tended towards lofty communalism, in the hope of reaching beyond the coarse nature of selfishness and sin, to find a more perfect human harmony. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Amos Bronson Alcott, father of the famous novelist Louisa May Alcott, were neighbors in Concord, Massachusetts, who set the pace of transcendentalism. Thoreau attempted to find serenity in 2 years, 1845 to 1847, of relative isolation in the woods at Walden Pond. Alcott in his experimental school in Concord, and Emerson in his philosophical lectures and writings. Emerson, born in 1803, grew up as the second of 5 sons. 2 daughters and another son died in infancy, of a Unitarian minister, William, and his wife, Rebecca. His father died when he was almost 8, and he was raised by a circle of women, including an aunt with whom he would become very close. At age 14, he entered Harvard College and graduated at age 18, surprisingly only in the middle ranking of his class. He went to work with a brother, William, teaching young women at his mother's home. When William went off to Germany to study divinity, he then established his own school. Several years later, he himself entered Harvard Divinity School for study. In early 1829, he was ordained to the ministry at Boston's Second Church as its junior pastor. Then tragedy began to hit Emerson. In 1831, his young wife, Ellen, died of tuberculosis. Then a younger and very brilliant brother, Edward, who had also long been struggling with his health, both emotional and physical, died of the same disease in 1834. Finally, another younger brother, Charles, died in 1836, also of tuberculosis. Emerson was devastated. Following his wife's death, he began to distance himself emotionally from traditional Christianity. The following year, 1832, he resigned his position at the church to begin the search elsewhere for the answers to life's questions. At the end of that year, he departed for a grand tour of Europe, where he would meet a number of such intellectual luminaries as the English philosopher John Stuart Mill and the Scottish lecturer and social commentator Thomas Carlyle. In Paris, he would become intrigued by the botanical gardens of the Jardin des Plantes, where he was struck by the personal insight of how things in life are interconnected. Returning to the States in October of 1833, he contemplated Carlyle's career as a lecturer, and the next month undertook the first of the 1,500 lectures he would offer over the next near half-century. These lectures would be his stock in trade, the source of a number of books that he would also publish. In 1835, he remarried Lydia or Lydian, and they moved to Concord, where 2 sons and 2 daughters were born. Here, in company with 3 other scholars, the Transcendental Club was founded, 1836, with the hope of birthing a community similar to the Salon of Europe, where intellectuals would gather to discuss weighty matters of life. Among those who would join them was Thoreau, for whom Emerson took on something of a role as a father figure. Emerson's split with Christianity became evident when, in 1838, he delivered a lecture at Harvard Divinity School, affirming that biblical miracles and the claim of Jesus' divinity were merely the inventions of the classic mind that assigned godlike qualities to their heroes. Emerson instead advocated something of a humanism that freed the soul from the shackles of traditional religion so that it could soar in search of the higher meaning of life. Harvard Divinity School was scandalized by his bold humanism. He would not be invited again to lecture there until 30 years later, when even Harvard Divinity School had begun to come around to holding many of Emerson's humanist ideas. Efforts were made by Emerson's neighbor Alcott to put their organic philosophy into full operation as an experiment in communal living, when the entirely vegetarian farm Fruitlands was established. It was not a grand success. After it failed, Emerson purchased another farm for Alcott for a second attempt. He even purchased 2 sections of land for himself, though he himself did not work the land. As it turned out, the Transcendentalists were better at thinking, discussing, lecturing, and publishing than at securing material success, although Emerson's lectures were beginning to pay well, and his books were being widely read. Emerson now branched into esoteric or universalistic study, taking up the study of Hindu Vedanta, reading the Bhagavad Gita, and commentaries on the Vedanta by Colebrook. His philosophy of the oneness of life now had the larger religious confirmation of the Hindu religion. This fit his temperament better than traditional Christianity. The earthier intelligentsia. But for those less comfortable, where life's dangers were not guaranteed to be manageable, where life could suddenly take on a violent turn, hunger, disease, Indian massacre, such humanist rationality seemed as absurd as their personal trust in the God of miracles seemed absurd to the humanists. Indeed, even Nathaniel Hawthorne, who once was a neighbor of the Concord Transcendentalists, eventually became something of an anti-transcendentalist, tending to delve more into the darkness of the religious ethical issues of the era in his novels The Scarlet Letter, 1850, and The House of the Seven Gables, 1851. Likewise, Edgar Allan Poe could be just as abrasive in his dislike of the romantic optimism of transcendentalism. There were also a number of other American writers and artists who represented well the life of the common man, the serene primitiveness of the American landscape, and the exotic culture of the Indians, giving excellent characterization of the democratic realities of life in America. James Fenimore Cooper wrote elegantly of the complexities of life in America in such novels as The Pioneers, 1823, and The Last of the Mohicans, 1826. And in the field of graphic art, the works of Thomas Cole and others of the Hudson River School were on a parallel with the best of European landscape artists of the same era, as were the works of George Bingham, who, in addition to his beautiful landscapes, portrayed insightfully democratic life in the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys. The Second Great Awakening. Declining spirituality. In the 1790s, the first decade of the new republic, it appeared as if Christianity had resolved itself simply into a civic religion, serving to provide a moral foundation and a discipline for the emerging United States as a distinct society. Certainly that is how the intellectuals, especially the deists among them, most all intellectuals at that point, understood things. But such civic religion does not fill churches, for it resides solely in the independent thinking and behavior of citizens as they go about their daily routines. It does not need pulpits to show the people how to go about doing such things. Human logic itself is pretty good at constructing such moral intellectual systems. The impact on the traditional churches. Part of this developing religious dynamic of Christianity as principally a civic religion was the way that the war and the consequent independence of American society had a tremendous impact on the religious character of America. The Church of England, beloved of the Tories, particularly prominent in the American South, was devastated. Footnote. In the years between the Great Awakening and America's War for Independence, the Church of England's Society for the Propagation of the Gospel not only sought to bring the unchurched of America to Christ, but more importantly, it set out to bring non-Anglican Christians to leave their Congregational, Presbyterian, Quaker churches and join the Church of England, being far more active in setting up Anglican churches in coastal New England and in the Middle Colonies than along the American frontier. This assault on American Protestantism was another one of the ways that England had infuriated the colonies and driven them to want full independence from the mother country. End of footnote. Eventually, it was able to service Anglican loyalties in America by establishing its own episcopal authority, and thus be able to carry on as before, but independent of England itself in doing so. As for the Calvinist Congregationalists in New England and Presbyterians in the Middle Colonies that had been active in leading the independence movement, post-war America had been expanding in population at a far greater rate than the slow process of producing seminary-trained pastors could meet the demand for new churches and individuals to pastor them. Also, the very logical character of Congregationalist and Presbyterian theology, especially among the more highly educated of the membership, including, importantly, pastors, caused many to be quite comfortable in the deist camp, leading them ultimately to switch their loyalties to the growing, well, for the time being anyway, Unitarian movement. Lay preachers. Baptists and Methodists, however, did not have this same problem, being open to the recruiting of lay pastors, that is, not seminary trained, but simply called out of general society to the ministry. These individuals had been led to take up their calls not by academic logic, but by a highly personal and most frequently highly emotional sense of personal judgment, moral cleansing, and a new purpose to their lives. a purpose calling them into full service to the very process that had personally saved them. They were on fire to bring others to the same spiritual renewal or revival that they themselves had gone through personally, and they were willing to face all sorts of obstacles, both by nature and by man, in order to bring, especially to the frontier where churches were virtually non-existent, the gospel of salvation in Jesus Christ to hungry hearts there. This was not mere, though necessary for one society, civic religion. This was religion of a very personal spiritual nature. Actually, Methodism's founder, John Wesley, has originally been most opposed to the American rebellion against English royal authority, and consequently almost all of the preachers Wesley had sent to the colonies returned to England when the war first broke out. But Francis Asbury stayed behind to organize Methodist lay preachers to help nurture American hearts during the dark days of the Revolution. After the war, Wesley agreed to ordain American Methodist pastors in order to bring the Methodists into some kind of proper or apostolic communion with the English Methodists. But ultimately, it was Asbury's lay preachers in America itself who would push Methodism forward, preachers who fit more closely the democratic mood of the times, able to relate better to life on the frontier. Methodist circuit riders. Also playing a key role in this development were the Methodist circuit riders. These circuit riders were simple men, themselves actually drawn from the frontier culture, who had answered a call from God to head out alone on horseback into the western wilderness, facing storms, hunger, and dangerous Indians, to bring the comfort of the Christian religion to scattered settlements and cabins that dotted the wilderness. Their offerings were not just the assurance that God was with them, but that they were also somehow still connected with the rest of society, which was also with them. The way the circuit riders helped settlers to keep body and soul together was thus enormously appreciated on the western frontier, where the Methodist Church, or at least the Methodist movement, grew rapidly, soon to become the largest of the Christian denominations in America. Camp revivals. The isolation of the frontier man naturally produced a deep hunger for meaning found within the context of some kind of community spirit, membership in larger society being a rare but well-appreciated commodity. Most frequently, this took the form of huge gatherings whenever a Christian revivalist appeared in the region. Thousands would turn out to spend a week at an improvised encampment, listening to an array of preachers, singing and dancing, shouting and fainting, and having a thoroughly good time. Taking a more structured and thus logical approach to camp revivalism was the lawyer-turned-Presbyterian minister Charles Grandison Finney. Though a Presbyterian, a denomination which traditionally viewed salvation as solely a matter of God's graceful election, and thus not really a personal work or achievement of man himself, Finney fit better the spirit of the Baptist and Methodist revivalists. He was required to appear before a Presbyterian board to examine his views on faith versus works, an issue which has caused considerable controversy since almost the founding of Christianity. In the end, he satisfied the board that he had preached a doctrine of grace rather than works, although his emphasis on repentance and renewal had more of a touch of works than grace. Footnote. But this subject has no Christian has ever satisfactorily resolved by mere logic or precise theological argument. End of quote. Finney's careful structuring of his revivals, both in the urban context of New York City and the rural context of upstate New York, became a model that other revivalists would follow. It helped not only tone down, somewhat, the emotional level of these revivals, it also put them on steadier religious foundations. All of this was having the effect of splitting the old Calvinist religions, that is, the Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Dutch Reform, between two camps: the New School group supporting the revivalist trend and the Old School group opposing it. Once again, similar to the earlier Great Awakening of the 1740s, the highly emotional character of these revivals seemed to Old School conservatives to be a most undignified way to bring people to Christ, and also very shallow in how it might develop Christian life over the long term in comparison to well thought through traditional Christian understanding. Worse, New School revivalism seemed to support the Arminian or Methodist idea that man was somehow able on his own to rise above his state of moral or self-focused depravity and elect or choose entirely on his own his personal salvation. Also, of course, the very idea that a person was not properly aligned with God without having one of these highly emotional moments of conversion seemed highly offensive to those raised since their youth to follow the lines of faith as best they could, understanding that they were indeed sinners, but always throughout their lives faithful Christians sensitive to the need to keep themselves open to the judgments of God. For this latter group of Old School or Christian conservatives, the suggestion that the path they were on was not sufficient because it had never arrived at an emotional crisis point of decision was outrageously ridiculous. A voice of compromise that would greatly impact his times and continue to do so even through the rest of the 1800s was that of Horace Bushnell, who took a unique position that aligned him exactly with none of the contending Christian groups, yet one that found value in all of them. With respect to the Old School Christians, he was quite respectful of the way traditional Christianity was able to shape from a person's very early life, even childhood, key Christian understandings that helped direct a person, elected purely by the grace of God, to the privilege of being born into a full Christian fellowship of Christian family and church, directed towards a long-term and deeply faithful Christian life. This understanding was clearly laid out in his very popular book, Christian Nurture, 1847. He was also supportive of the Unitarian and Arminian or Wesleyan or Methodist viewpoint that man did have the responsibility, and thus the choice in the matter, of disciplining or ordering his own thoughts and actions as part of the mature Christian life. And for the Transcendentalists, he agreed that the mystical approach to God was vital to a strong personal relationship with God. However, to Bushnell, not a God in the form of some transcendentalist universalist deity, but a God in the Trinitarian form of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And with the revivalists, he believed that though such revivalism was not necessary for everyone to reach God, it certainly served very well those who had become quite lost in their journey in life, and was an authentic way of bringing such lost but spiritually hungry souls to Christ, although revival always needed to be followed up by ongoing fellowship with the worshiping community in order to make the salvation event a lasting transformation. Although he would draw criticism from all of the communities for his less than full embrace of their respective positions, his ability to see Christianity above these divisions would become of great value to American Christianity in the days ahead. Christian mission societies. Another feature of the Second Great Awakening, working along lines similar to Bushnell's, was the growth of a large number of interdenominational Christian societies that sought to set Christianity to the task of taking on social problems, to provide Christian answers to such issues as poverty, illiteracy, and just plain ignorance of the Christian gospel. Working even across denominational lines, that is, Congregationalist, Presbyterian, Dutch Reform, Baptist, Methodist, etc., Americans were very active in forming such groups as the American Bible Society, to help every American family find itself in possession of a Bible, the American Sunday School Union, to develop biblical literacy among the children of all social classes, the American Tract Society, to put in the hands of everyone the simplest explanation of and call to Christianity, the American Anti-Slavery Society, and the American Temperance Leagues, both fighting particular social evils. These volunteer organizations became a vital part of the American social cultural dynamic that developed in accompaniment with America's spread across the North American continent. Christian colleges. From the time of the Puritans' early settlement in America, higher education was a matter of vital necessity, not only in training their pastors who would be expected to lead the Christian communities that the Puritans were establishing, but in training in other areas such as the law, business and finance, and teacher training, all so vital to the life of their communities. Thus, Christian America founded Harvard, Yale, William and Mary, Georgetown, the Log Cabin College, which eventually has become Princeton University, New Brunswick and Andover theological seminaries, as well as colleges such as Mount Holyoke, designed to give women the same opportunity at higher education. In fact, in the period between the founding of the colonies and the mid-1800s, over 500 colleges were founded by America's various denominations. This, too, is a key part of Christian America's larger mission to be a light to the nations. Perfectionism and millennialism. Beyond all this religious activity was something very much of the spirit of the Jacksonian times. As Tocqueville had noticed, Americans had a strong sense of personal destiny, an urgency to accomplish some greater work, to move forward, to fulfill some noble purpose in life. Life was viewed as a challenge, one faced with many obstacles, many of them deficiencies in the people themselves, personal sins that needed cleansing, that required some act of purification that would clear the way for them towards some personal victory. Christian revivals offered exactly just such an opportunity for getting things right with God. Millennialism. Footnote. A belief that the coming of Christ will usher in a 1,000-year golden age, a long period of time prior to the day of judgment, and the establishment of a new heaven and a new earth. Empowering this activity was an abiding sense that history was about to find completion in the form of the second coming of Christ and his final judgment of all people, saints and sinners, a widespread sentiment of the times due in part to the horrible 1837-1841 Depression, which undercut severely the American belief that life moved forward along largely logical lines. Surely this grand catastrophe pointed to the ultimate and thus final judgment of God in the form of the long-awaited coming of Christ as the ultimate judge of life on earth. Perfectionism. Consequently, many Americans came easily to the conclusion that they were approaching the millennium described in Scripture, that is in the book of Revelation, in which all must be made perfect in preparation for that final coming of Christ. Sinful behavior needed to be corrected, both for society as well as the individual. Perfectionism or social reform was thus urgent. Alcoholism. The institution of slavery, in particular, needed to be abolished immediately. Alcoholism, which was rampant on the frontier and in the workshops back east, needed to be curbed. Caring for the poor became a priority. Injustices of whatever variety needed to be addressed, the treatment of women being one of the issues taken up by a new generation of feminists. Social experiments accompanied this mood, in which varieties of utopian programs were put in place to answer the challenge of the times. Most of these failed miserably, but failure did not seem to discourage others from trying. the Millerites and Seventh-day Adventists. Another New York revivalist was the farmer and Baptist lay preacher William Miller, who in 1833 predicted, on the basis of calculations he drew up from the book of Daniel, that the long-awaited event of Jesus Christ's return to earth was going to take place sometime in the period 1843 to 1844, the accompanying rapture also ending life on this planet. His views began to gain wider acceptance as the 1840s loomed into view, his prophecy even taken up by followers in England, Norway, and Chile. Ultimately, in 1844, he and his followers gathered on hilltops and rooftops in March, again in April, and finally in October in anticipation of the rapture. But instead, a great disappointment occurred when Jesus failed to show up on schedule, causing his following to break up. Surprisingly, however, this was not the end of his massive religious movement. Others picked up Miller's vision, converting it into a millennialist perspective. Importantly, the female prophet Ellen White, who cultivated a huge group of followers that would eventually take the name Seventh-day Adventists. They took up perfectionist ways in the avoidance of alcohol, meat, and other foods, advocating instead vegetarianism. From this group would eventually come such famous breakfast food producers as Kellogg and Post. Footnote: vegetarianism was a common trend among the millennialists who believed that meat eating made man a brutal beast. The burned-over district and the Mormons. One of the places of note with respect to American revivalism during this time period was the so-called burned-over district of Western New York. Footnote: this was a term assigned by Finney to a region that had had so many revivals that Finney was certain that there could be no one left there yet to convert. Here in this upstate New York, wave after wave of millennialist revivals occurred, producing some of the most notable elements of the Second Great Awakening. The Millerites were very numerous in this region. Shakers were also numerous in this part of the state. Footnote: the Shakers, as the Quakers before them, were noted for the shaking of their bodies when they entered into a rapturous union with the Spirit of God. They were notable also in that they believed that sex was bestial behavior, and thus they did not have offspring of their own, forcing them to keep the community going through converts. The Utopian Oneida Society was established there also to practice the ideal of social communalism. Footnote: communalism, all property held jointly, the equality of both sexes, children belonging to the whole community, the profits of workmanship shared communally, etc. But perhaps the most amazing phenomenon to come out of this burned-over district of Western New York during this period were the Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, a group that followed the prophecies and teachings of Joseph Smith, Jr. As a teenager, Smith had a number of visions, the most important being a visit by the angel Moroni in 1827, who directed him to a place where he uncovered a book of golden plates on which were written in some form of reformed Egyptian the story of the ancient Jews and of Christ and his visit to America. Using a special technique, he translated what he saw written there by ancient authors, Mormon being chief among them, which in 1830 Smith published in English translation as the Book of Mormon. Footnote: the book states that an ancient tribe of Israel had managed to get themselves to the New World, as well as Jesus himself, who appeared to the Indians soon after his resurrection, producing several centuries of exceptional peace among the Indians. Indeed, the book claims that the Indians were in fact descendants of these Israelites. That same year, he formed his first congregation as the Church of Christ, teaching his followers the new doctrines, and then sending them west to spread the new revelation as Latter-day Saints. His ultimate goal was to establish a new Zion, a community of the Latter-day Saints, to prepare for the way for the coming of Christ. At first he thought it would be in Ohio, where in 1831 a large group of his followers assembled. But then some of his followers moved on to Missouri, planning to establish his New Jerusalem or Zion there. But they ran into trouble when the local citizens reacted to the Mormons pouring into their area. Smith ran into the resistance of the local Missouri militia when he arrived in Missouri to try to secure the land for his followers, and thus he decided to build his temple in Ohio. But a major bank failure, resulting from the Panic of 1837, undermined the harmony of his followers, and Smith migrated with those who still remained with him back to Missouri, once again facing stiff resistance there, except this time organized by the governor of Missouri, who was determined to drive the Mormons from his state. Footnote. There were a number of reasons for local opposition to the Mormons, especially since the Book of Mormon seems so contradictory to the teachings of the Bible, and because of the polygamy, that is, multiple marriage partners, practiced by some of the Mormons. There in Missouri, some 8,000 Mormons followed Smith to Nauvoo along the Mississippi on the Illinois side of the river. For the next few years, he was able to proceed in the building of his temple, until now the citizens of Illinois began to take up arms against the Mormons. Then in June of that year, Smith and his brother Hiram were killed by an angry mob, throwing the Mormon community into confusion as to who was then to lead them. At this point, a number of Smith's colleagues stepped forward to claim succession. Brigham Young took the lead, although other individuals also claimed the title and led their followers off to form their own separate Mormon communities. But after 2 years of trying to make things work out for them in Illinois, Young decided in 1846 to take his followers west, all the way to the Utah Territory in 1847, where they hoped to be able to build their community in peace. There, indeed, they found that security, at least for a decade, and from there began to send out missionaries to the larger world around them to build a new faith in anticipation of the coming millennium.